Hey everybody, Tom Barnes, Stories from the 78 here in the historic Jackson Boulevard area of the West Loop. You're actually looking at Adams, but the story from the 78 today is an incredible story, and it's not mine to tell. It's my friend Reuben's, who's right here behind me. This is Reuben Taylor, everybody. How you doing, Reuben?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, Reuben, it's a pleasure being here. And before we get into how you ended up at 1528 Adams and your Lincolns and your collection of everything, this mini car plant that you have here on Chicago's West Side, fascinating story about your grandfather and the Wright brothers and the engine, the first engine built for them and their plane. Explain that whole story for me, will you?
Well, I'll do the best I can. Sure. There. I personally met and spent a whole summer with my grandfather in Dearborn, Michigan in 1941.
Okay.
Now, my granddad was a self-taught machinist, and we can't really find out from any records we have exactly how much schooling he had or how he even learned the skills that he did have. We do know that his parents had a hog farm in Cerro Gordo, Illinois.
Okay.
There was a hog cholera epidemic, and apparently that wiped the farming business out. So my grandfather, whose name was Charlie Taylor, and his parents moved to Kearney, Nebraska.
Okay.
In Kearney, my grandfather worked for a family member, last name Webert, who had a printing business, and so my grandfather was in the printing business while he was there in Kearney. There was also a gentleman named Bishop Wright, who was an itinerant person who came through and taught about his church and so on, and he knew one way or another my grandfather's parents, and that's how he came to be talking to my grandfather one time and told him that there was opportunity for people with mechanical skills in Dayton, Ohio. And so my grandfather moved to Dayton. Of course, there's a question how it came about that my father was born in Lincoln, Nebraska, because that's a long way from Kearney, but
sure,
that's where my dad was born.
Okay.
And the Taylors moved to Dayton, and as I understand it, one way or another, those senior Taylors also not only owned property in Dayton as well, they also owned a building that was rented to a pair of brothers named Orville and Wilbur Wright. So the Taylors were renting to the Wrights, basically.
Unbelievable.
What it amounted to. And my grandfather honed his skills in various machine shops, apparently. This was in the late 1890s, and then even started his own shop and sold it to a company called Stoddard Manufacturing. Stoddard eventually was bought by Chrysler, so we could even say my granddad worked for Chrysler for a while, but it wasn't that. It wasn't Chrysler at the time. My grandfather was making parts for these brothers, Orville and Wilbur, basically for their bicycle business. And then they needed some parts for gliders that they were experimenting with in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina.
Right.
So it became efficient, I guess, for the Wright brothers to hire my grandfather to work for them full-time, making parts, and also managing their bicycle shop while they were in Kitty Hawk. Now the Kitty Hawk operation was generally an end of the year type of thing because the winds were more steady at that time, and also, of course, cold air is denser than warm air,
Yeah.
making it possible to have lift on airfoils that's just a little bit greater with low temperature than it is with high. In any event, as the glider experiments progressed, discussions arose regarding the powering of the gliders. The Wright brothers and my grandfather went out looking for bids for somebody that would make an engine that would power a glider. And the specifications were 160-pound weight and 8 horsepower. At the time, the auto manufacturer's rule of thumb was 100 pounds per horsepower, so an 8 horsepower engine would be 800 pounds, not 160 pounds.
Which would make it impossible to fly.
And it would, at least it would be impossible for the gliders that the Wright brothers had in mind. And after getting bids from 13 car companies that wanted to make 800-pound engines, minimum quantity of 100, my grandfather said to his employers one day, "I can make that engine." And so they sketched out what was wanted, and in less than 6 weeks, my grandfather delivered the world's first aircraft engine to them. And they put it on a glider, and yes, it powered the world's first heavier-than-air aircraft on December 17 of 1903.
That is an incredible story. And your great-grandfather's name again?
Well, it's my grandfather, wasn't my
grandfather.
My grandfather was Charles E. Taylor, and I have in fact named my son Charles E. Taylor as well, with the Roman number 2 after it, and he named his son putting a number 3 behind it. So I guess the Charlie Taylor name will continue on for a few years.
Rightfully so. A proud story for sure. Reuben, thank you so much for sharing that. That's one story that you have. I mean, that's one story that this gentleman has. He has another one about Lincolns. And Reuben, you're going to share that story with me here in a second. We're going to go down and we're going to talk about how you ended up at 1528 Adams and the story of Lincolns and how your father purchased it and how now you're restoring them to drive them, right?
That is the story, yes.
All right, well, let's go. Let's check it out, shall we?
Let's go.
All right, so you're looking at a 1926 Lincoln, and it is the property of my friend Reuben Taylor. How are you, Reuben?
Good morning. I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for letting me kind of just see inside your world here that you have a fair amount of Lincolns and you have parts for Lincolns and other cars as well that you've amassed over your career. But first things first, you are a Chicagoan, but you started off your life in Mexico, right?
That is correct.
What part?
250 miles south of the U.S. border in a town called Chihuahua.
Chihuahua, Mexico, and then your fascination for the Lincolns, though, started with your father, correct?
My father bought a 1926 Lincoln in 1936, and essentially I learned to drive in that car, and then I did a fair amount of maintenance when I was very young. I mean, like starting at 9 years old and moving forward from there.
Right, and you have a fascinating story, Reuben, where you were out on the East Coast, you served time in the Army, the United States Army, but you were part of certain regimes where you worked for General Electric, you worked for a power plant. Like, talk about your early days and how you ended up in Chicago, and we can't forget about your 62 years of bliss with your wife as well.
And fortunately, she was cooperative and venturesome as well. So it was a good time throughout. We lived and worked in Florida and Puerto Rico, then in Pennsylvania, and finally in Chicago starting in 1970. So it's been a long venture getting from, you might say, school to here, but once we got here, we got embedded, and it's just too difficult to jettison everything and go somewhere else. So I'm stuck.
You're here in Chicago, but before we get to like where we're at here in this room where you're restoring Lincolns, and there's a Cadillac and a Mercury, which is clearly a passion of yours to restore these old cars. You worked, helped trying to get what was the nuclear company that you were involved with?
In addition to the General Electric experience, I worked for a company called General Nuclear Engineering, which was part of a bigger company called Combustion Engineering. Combustion Engineering doesn't exist anymore. It's been absorbed into a company called ABB, which is a Swiss organization. The career ended in Chicago, started out excuse me, in manufacturing heavy-duty industrial gearboxes. It was for a company at the time called Foote Brothers, owned by Litton Industries, and Litton sold 2 of the 4 manufacturing plants that comprised that enterprise in Chicago, and neither buyer nor seller wanted half of me. So what I ended up doing is buying a small wood products manufacturing company making movable louvered shutters. I bought that in early 1973, and ran it for 16 years until 1988. Had to move it from quarters near Halsted and Grand in Chicago to 1528 West Adams, and that is where we are essentially right now.
Right, and now this building has a lot of history to it, though. It used to make arcade machine parts, and some gambling type of paraphernalia that was used back in the day. Maybe some honest, maybe not so honest, as you were telling me. What was the name of the building?
The company that occupied the property was called H.C. Evans Company.
Okay.
And yes, they made interesting type gaming equipment like loaded dice. They also had an operation making roulette wheels, but as I understand it, the roulette wheel business ended when the last 2 employees retired.
Okay.
And the building that the roulette wheel operation occupied doesn't exist anymore. The foundation is between 1528 and 1516 West Adams, and we now own both of those properties. So yes, we have the foundation of an old building, but nothing more about it. After the building was used by H.C. Evans, it came into the hands of a man named Ed Blondin. And Ed, I don't know whether he started or acquired a business making metal-clad wood moldings under the name of Midwest Moldings. When I met Ed was at the time that he was wanting to sell his property in 1979. He had occupied the property for well over 20 years, and he sold all the machinery to someone whom I don't know, and again, I'm sort of a little foggy as to just when he started or whether he acquired a going organization. Somewhere in my collection I have some World War II posters that are framed in these metal-clad moldings, and they are excellent examples of what the company made. And because they're World War II, I'm thinking that Ed London may have acquired a going organization and perhaps brought it to 1528 West Adams when H.C. Evans, I'm presuming, somehow went out of business.
And this factory building in general is on Adams, you said, and it's on a historical part of Adams, and its neighborhood has seen downfall and regentrification, and now it is one of the most happening neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, being at the West Loop. But you still keep things modest here with all of these beautiful parts that you call this collection of parts that are towards restoring Lincolns, because you have a lot of them and you have a lot of parts with them. And we went through one room where you just have just a mass collection of these parts, old engines, old crankshafts, tires, specifically though for a lot of Lincolns, a Mercury. And then we come into this room here where you have a few Lincolns that are pretty close to being completely restored here.
You know, the whole objective of this facility is to assemble as many of these parts as we can. We have a shop in the 1528 West Adams building where we can make parts. We're standing in 1516 West Adams, which is essentially my assembly operation.
And you have like a mini car plant here where you can make parts that don't exist. That's all that machinery will walk through in the other building. And that's something that you just kind of picked up either on hands learning or through your career, you know, and your trajectory from years ago. You've kind of learned how to make all these pieces to fix these cars and complete them, because some of the parts just don't exist.
This is correct. My impetus for my machining operation was basically purchasing almost all of it at auction in 1993. And once I had bought it, the question was how to run it. So I spent the next 2 years full-time evenings at College of DuPage machine shop and welding shop.
Teaching learning from professors, but essentially you've taught yourself a lot of this, and you have a few cars just in this room alone, and you have parts of cars that have seen better days. But one of the things I wanted to talk about specifically was the wood. I didn't realize that cars had these wood frames, specifically Lincolns, and you said that the frames were interchangeable, but that wood frame, you called it something. What was it? Sheathing?
Well, what we're looking at are standard manufacturing procedures for the era, meaning 20s to 30s. At that time, the cars were built out of wood frames, and then they were covered with generally aluminum or steel. Lincoln happened to be using aluminum. But as you probably know, one of the most common automobiles was the Model T, followed by the Model A that Ford Company made, and all those were steel-sheathed wood frames. But yes, the concept was build a wood frame and cover it with metal. I think that came from just starting as carriages. In other words, before automobiles, carriages were all made out of wood, and it was natural for those carriage companies to try to stay in business by doing something that was relevant, and it went from just horse-drawn carriages to gasoline-powered carriages.
That's incredible that all of that history you have here. You have like a walking museum right here in your space here. And I asked you earlier, what's the goal to bring these to online to sell? And you're like, no, you just want to drive.
No, my whole goal is restoration. And if I get it restored, I want to drive it.
Absolutely.
That is just the very simple.
And Reuben, you're 92 years old. You still work on cars. You still drive.
Not quite 90.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll make 90 on Halloween this year, but yeah, I'm getting close to that.
So you're going to be 90. I apologize.
So time is running out. This is true, and I'm trying to get help. Things like COVID has slowed us down. One individual that has been very cooperative with me, Tom Bowler, and if he were here, he could tell a lot of stories too, because he also works on these old cars.
It's an incredible story, Reuben. And before I'd be remiss not to ask your wife's name, since we mentioned her earlier, but you've been married for 62 years. You're coming up on your 90th, and you're still driving. You're still working on these cars. You still have a passion for it. But what's your wife's name?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Your wife's name.
Oh, my wife is Emily.
Emily.
Emily, unfortunately, is in a nursing home and needs 24/7 care. So you might say I'm the caretaker economically, but that I don't do it physically.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that's a full-time job in itself. But Reuben and Emily, your story, though, your legacy will live on through these cars and what you've done to keep the Lincoln restoration process alive with your collection of parts downstairs, your manufacturing equipment, but you have essentially your own assembly plant right here in Chicago's West Loop, and I think that's a fantastic story.
Thank you very, very much for listening to it. Have a great day.
Absolutely. And that is the story from the 78 at 1528 Adams. I'm Tom Barnes, tombarneschicago@gmail.com. If you have a suggestion for a story from the 78, or head over to my website, storyfromthe78.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you.